Hello, happy Wednesday, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this week's Takeover. We have an incredible group of scientists here with us today to discuss the question, what could life on other planets look like? So we have with us Dr. Deanna Hooper, Ian McLaughlin, and Abyss. I'll just leave it at that. Data scientist, neuroscientist, and theoretical physicist here. Thank you so much for joining us all today, guys. Let's bring them up on screen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And today we are all fortunate to be joined by several fascinating and knowledgeable individuals to all participate in what I think is going to be a pretty fun discussion. What could life on other planets look like? And I know Peter just introduced everybody, but we have Dr. Deanna Hooper, a theoretical physicist. We have, or will have imminently, Professor David Dunn, who teaches astronomy. We will also have Georgia Oteri, a wildlife biologist who focuses on evolution and bats, which is pretty cool. And then we have the mysterious and compelling Abyss, who is a data scientist. And this is just for me. I don't think he identifies this way, but he's also a polymath. Okay, so hi, everybody. How are you all doing?
Hey, great to be here. Great to be here on another takeover. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. I think we're going to tap into all of our love of sci-fi. So really happy to be part of this.
Professor David Dunn has joined us. How are you, David?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Okay, so before we decided to broaden today's topic a bit, I figured it might be good if I just sort of set the table a little bit. And so we're going to begin, when we were beginning this idea, we were focused on a specific mechanism by which alternative life forms might emerge. And so, all of us, maybe with the exception of Abyss, that remains to be discovered, we're all carbon-based life forms, right? And as the phrase suggests, it means that all of our complex biology depends critically on the presence and availability of carbon. And so I know that basically zero people are thrilled to look at a periodic table of elements, but just bear with me just for one sec. So you see that little red square? I don't know if you can quite see it, but see that little red square? That is carbon on the periodic table. And it's a rather useful element here on Earth because it can form so many chemical bonds. It can form 4 single bonds or 2 double bonds. But you see all those letters, just beneath carbon, just beneath that red square, they also can form the same number of bonds. But the bonds that carbon forms on Earth are quite stable, and so they stick around for a while. And carbon is also the smallest member of that crew. And so as a result, molecules can grow to be complex and bigger because the bonds are so stable. And that's at least partly because of the conditions on Earth. And so that has caused scientists over the years to speculate, if we tweaked the conditions this way or that, who's to say that an element like silicon might be able to play a similar role that carbon plays? And so that brings us to our initial question for everybody here. Could there be silicon-based life? And if so, what could that life look like? So maybe, I don't know, why don't we start with Deanna?
Yeah, so I think this is a really cool question that obviously comes up a lot in sci-fi, and I have been asked in my own streams multiple times. It's a very interesting option. Now, one thing that always stands out to me is that if we consider just on Earth, silicon is actually much more abundant than carbon on Earth, right? And yet life evolved to be carbon-based, which means that, to me, that means that silicon-based life is not so likely. But from what we do know of hypothetical silicon-based life, I mean, we wouldn't be talking about complex human-like structures, but more like rocks that live, which is kind of cool. So in sci-fi, we always see it as like a bipedal that's just made of synthetics, but it would be more like rocks. And I really like the idea of talking rocks, or just rocks that are capable of higher thought processes than other animals. Now, that to me is an incredibly fascinating topic. I know it's not how we normally think of silicon-based life, but just the idea of a chunk of silicon actually talking would be very fun.
Okay, yeah. So you know, one of the things about silicon. Well, actually, no. Let me stop there. So Professor Dunn,
Yeah.
What do you think? Is silicon-based life forms yay or nay? And what do you think they might look like?
Well, I think silicon, as Deanna said, it doesn't seem like it was favored over carbon, and I think the bonds in silicon, are going to be weaker than they are in carbon. So that makes it tougher to, I think, have building blocks and so forth. So in theory, you could replace silicon with carbon and try to construct some sort of DNA. I think it's going to be tougher to construct those molecules in the end here. But I like science fiction, so I think of what's the Horta from Star Trek. So I think the Shambling Mound, which is not bipedal, it's quite different looking. So I'll give them that. And we walk through rock like we walk through air, so that's different. So yeah.
Well, so since you brought up the Horta, I feel like we should just go straight to it. So, for anybody who's unfamiliar, this is the Horta. Well, one of them's Captain Kirk, who's not silicon-based, but the sort of weird-looking mass in front of him, that's the Horta. And so the Horta was supposed to be a silicon-based life form, and so it's actually specifically episode 26 in the original series, in case anybody's interested in checking it out. And so the whole concept of the Horta is that every 50,000 years, all of the Horta die off except for one, who then looks after the spawn of the next generation. Okay, and so I have some more sort of fun concepts of what a silicon-based life form could look like. But Abyss, are you silicon-based? And if so, what do you look like?
Yeah, so I'm carbon-based for now. But so it's a very interesting question to have silicon-based life form. Of course, Deanna and David actually mentioned that silicons actually can be a best substitute for carbon. But most of the chemicals, or at least molecules that are formed from silicon, don't exhibit that much of dynamism. So if you have silicon oxide, for example, right? So normally you will have that as in a solid state as opposed to gaseous, which is carbon dioxide in its oxide form. So that by itself would put some kind of constraints as to if silicon were to be the building block for a life form in other places. But again, we're talking about from Earth conditions, right? If you're talking about, say, a planet which is very close to its native star, then you will have different dynamics there. So yeah, it's difficult to say, but since we now know that most of the stable stars that actually have made it so far are sufficiently distant from their native star that they're not bombarded by this constant heat, I think it's fair to assume that silicon life form may be rare, but that's my opinion.
So before we depart, I mean, I agree with obviously everything you've all said. But before we depart, just to have a little bit of fun, let's just loosely play around with the idea of a life form that's just straight up replaced its carbon with silicon. One of the funny consequences of that kind of a system, and Abyss brought this up, is that it's respiration, assuming that it would need to breathe, and we can talk about that more in a little bit if anybody's interested. But it's breathing when we breathe, right? The carbon involved in our breath, carbon dioxide, is the byproduct of carbon getting oxidized, of course, right? Which becomes a gas conveniently, and we can just sort of breathe it out easily. You're probably doing it right now. I would be willing to bet. But when silicon gets oxidized, it doesn't become a gas, as Abyss was saying. It becomes a solid that looks like this, right? And this is a large crystalline form, right? You're more familiar with silicon. If you've ever gone to the beach, you've been surrounded by it, or silicon dioxide. And so we could imagine an organism that would have to somehow excrete solid material instead of breathing out gas, which is kind of funny to imagine. So there's this book by Stanley Weisbaum called A Martian Odyssey, where there's an organism that's 500,000 years old, barely ever moves, but when it does, about once every 10 minutes, it just deposits a brick of crystal. Right, and so our exhalations contain carbon dioxide. Its exhalation contains silica, and so it's basically either excreting crystals or just spitting up sand. So obviously unrealistic, but that's probably kind of what it would have to look like. But anyway, so okay. there are some interesting experiments that have been done where scientists have tried to replace the skeletons of very small organisms called diatoms with silicon. And they've been successful, but it was some very fancy chemistry. So I agree, probably unlikely. Okay, so if not silicon-based life forms, does anybody have any concepts of alternatives to silicon-based life forms that you could, imagine very loosely, creatively?
Before we move on from silicon, can I make another comment there?
Please.
So you mentioned that these silicon-based life forms would not be able to breathe in oxygen in the same way we do. From an astrophysical point of view, this actually makes them very interesting because we know a lot of exoplanets do not have a breathable atmosphere. We don't even need to look so far as exoplanets. We can take one of the moons that we have here in our solar system, Titan, one of the moons of Saturn. I know we have an image ready. This is a moon that has no oxygen. But if there's no oxygen, it's also very rich in silicon. So this combination actually does favor silicon-based forms over carbon-based forms because silicon-based forms could actually survive in a low oxygen environment. From what we were saying before as well, these silicon bonds are much weaker than carbon bonds. One thing that they need to thrive is actually high temperatures. So Titan actually has the perfect environment with very high temperatures and very low oxygen. That if we were to look for silicon-based life forms anywhere in the solar system, would be my bet of where to look for them. So I'm not saying that Titan is populated with silicon-based life forms, but it has a higher chance than any other body in the solar system.
Okay, yeah, I have more to say on Titan. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, the Earth is probably anomalous because oxygen that we have here is produced by life. Because, the local situations or the local, planetary dynamics does not allow for oxygen to be produced. It's just that in the ancient times, in the Cambrian explosion, you had cyanobacteria kind of producing mass of the oxygen. Right now, there's a balance between plant life and animal life. So oxygen by itself is a rarity. I'm just trying to build up on what Deanna was just saying.
Yeah, and so I brought up those diatoms just really quickly. I actually didn't know this statistic, but I was just looking it up. Those diatoms are these tiny, tiny, tiny little organisms, right? That a group had successfully replaced its sort of skeleton with silicon, silicon. But okay, it turns out that that group, that kind of organism, produced something like 20 to 50% of the Earth's oxygen, which is kind of bananas when you think about it, right? You probably have never even heard of diatoms, but without them, we probably wouldn't be here. But before we move on, so David Howden has an interesting prompt here. So David says, I wonder if we could come up with a general definition of life not dependent on specific chemistry, something like patterns of complex information that persist or complexify over time. Does anybody have any thoughts?
I think it's really an important question of how we define life because there are several different definitions. We also have this problem just classifying things on Earth. We can come back to the typical example of our virus is alive. And it's a matter of debate. It really depends how you define life. I think the idea that life has to take in energy, has to reproduce. To me, this does constitute life, but it's a very good question. And I think if we were to find life elsewhere in the universe, it might be life that we have not even considered possible. So we do really need to broaden our definition of life when searching for anything that's actually living.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And so I guess I can't help it as a biologist that worked with viruses. I have a soft spot in my heart for viruses. And so, but what's interesting about that debate is that, so viruses are basically just very, very simple sets of instructions of DNA or RNA. We've all become rather familiar with one virus in particular. But first of all, there's a team that has generated an alternative to DNA and RNA. So it's not deoxyribo or ribonucleic acid, that's DNA and RNA. They call it xenonucleic acid, XNA. And so they were able to create a completely non-Earth-based, well, not completely, but largely non-Earth-based information storage system, genetic information storage system. And there are certain viruses on Earth that do kind of blur the line between what we consider to be alive and not alive, and those are giant viruses, one of my favorite things in the world. And so these viruses are giant, believe it or not. The name suits them. They have like hundreds and hundreds of genes, over 1 million base pairs of their genome. And keep in mind, like SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, only doesn't have remotely close to that many base pairs. It has like 30,000. This virus that you're seeing right here, this giant virus called the Mimi virus, has over 1 million. And so these things, when they were first seeing fossil evidence of these things, scientists thought that they were bacteria, which are essentially always larger than viruses. So, all of a sudden you start to see these viruses that are quite gigantic. But for all the reasons that Deanna listed, one way to think about viruses is that rather than being a branch on the evolutionary tree of life, maybe they're more like a vine that crawls up the tree of life. Anyways, thank you for giving me that opportunity to go on and on, Deanna. If anybody has any other thoughts regarding viruses, by all means.
I'm kind of curious, like if viruses had some kind of crucial role in molding how we behave, or how we are, because like as we grow from like the simple state to like a well-organized eukaryote cells, right? Viruses are generally known to like inject genetic material that would inevitably alter the DNA sequence of the native cell. So I wonder if they had like a major role in influencing how we look like, because the whole innovation, or at least like the whole and I guess like I could say discovery about CRISPR was based upon how bacteria deter viral infection by creating palindromes of nucleotides in their DNA. So I'm just kind of curious, like if that's possible, like if that's possible, then can we actually have acquired virus DNA or virus RNA, I guess in this case, that is like part of our building block eventually?
So this, I mean, this is like one of my favorite topics. And of course, you're absolutely right. We are part virus. One of the most important things in human evolution, without this thing, humans would not exist, is the placenta, right? Viruses have always played a massive role in human biology, but the placenta is my favorite example. So, the placenta is the organ that's critical to, the ability of humans to sustain a pregnancy, right? And there's very good evidence to suggest that a specific protein called syncytin, or syncytin, some people say, but I think it's syncytin, this is a protein that functions as the interface between the placenta, or I'm sorry, the developing embryo and the mother's body. Without this protein, placentas could not function. And there's very good evidence to suggest that the gene for syncytin is actually not originally mammalian. It's rather that gene was inserted into the genome of one of our very distant, ancestors during early animal evolution by a retrovirus. And the gene is called HERV-W. And so the thought is that we primates got this gene over 24 million years ago via some ancient viral infection by a virus that can incorporate itself into the genome, right? It's called a retrovirus, like HIV is capable of doing that. But it just happened to produce this protein that ended up being super helpful. And that's just one example. There are a bunch of other examples, but yeah, I mean, you're right on. So if they're not alive, they're certainly important to life.
So I've never heard that our placenta is only possible because of a virus. That is super cool. That's a fun party fact.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so Deanna, I mean, you mentioned Titan, and of course, as I was sort of like coming through some notes that I've had from the past and looking at discussions of life on other celestial bodies, what one way to think about what another form of life could be is, what about life forms that instead of relying on water, for example, what if they relied on some other liquid? Right, and so there's this concept of methanogens, right? And so it's essentially, so something about Titan obviously is that the temperature situations are different, the pressure situations are different, obviously, but its atmosphere doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it. It has a lot of methane, right? And so there's this paper by a NASA scientist named Chris McKay where he speculates about methanogens. But so could any of you sort of imagine what a life form would be like, or if a life form could exist that relied on, whose evolution relied on methane rather than the very lovely water that we all take, that we all hold so dear?
I guess the big question to me there is, chemically, does the methane allow them to produce enough energy? Right? Because we know that water is part of the energy cycle that we need. It's something that we need to produce enough energy to survive. So would they be able to get the same energy with methane? Speaking here, just like, don't quote me on this, but I think these bonds would be weaker. And so any methane-based life form I would expect to be much smaller than the water-based ones, just because it would be harder to extract the energy that they need. So if there were such things, I would think more microscopic bacteria-style things, and not actually things that we would recognize as an animal or as a plant, but rather just as microscopic organisms, which would also be cool, but much harder to find.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, yeah. So Abyss or Professor Dunn, do you have any thoughts on a methane world?
Well, I think, of course, the environment's quite different, and you have to worry about temperatures maybe obviously being lower. If you're talking about liquid methane, that's going to be a certain low temperature. And again, as Deanna said, the bonds here are going to be a problem to keep. But yeah, a smaller life, again, if we're talking about any life, would be amazing. So if you get something analogous to bacteria, a methane bacteria, that would be quite lovely. It's too bad my colleague isn't here. He's actually teaches astrobiology. He thinks about this. So
that would be nice.
I've gotten some exposure to it from him, but I'm not the expert here. It's been quite amazing, all the stuff you've been telling me.
Very cool.
So.
And so this paper that I mentioned by that NASA scientist, obviously it's more complicated than I'm getting into, but his whole argument is that, you could theoretically have a life form that would, consume hydrogen, acetylene, and ethane, and then it would exhale or emit, methane. So as opposed to the, tiny organisms that we were talking about earlier that emit oxygen. For me, I mean, my fundamental problem with this concept is that, methane is nonpolar, right? And so water is polar. That's what makes water the magical solvent that it is. That's why oftentimes when people are talking about like, oh, could there be life on other planets? The first thing that they think to look for is water, because all kinds of chemical reactions can happen in water that can't happen in nonpolar solvents. However, there is another polar solvent that could potentially function at least somewhat like water, and that is ammonia. And so, so all the problems with a methane-based life form, right, because of its nonpolar, characteristics, that doesn't exactly apply to ammonia. So what do you all think? Do you think that that's possible? It does happen to be fairly prevalent throughout the universe?
I think so, because I think ammonia and hydrogen sulfide were the major components in the Philae lander, or at least like the comet in which the Philae lander actually landed. So I think it goes to show that these two chemicals are not uncommon. And given that you have that rhythmic cycling of comets, like they go to close to the native star where you have sort of like the ice glaciers kind of venting off steam, basically. So you have that dynamics there. Everything is not at a static form. So that is a possibility. That's the first thing that jumped to me, like when you said something about ammonia, and I was thinking about hydrogen sulfide and methane and how abundant these molecules are in the universe.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, there are problems with ammonia that It's not necessarily ideal. It has a very, very tight temperature range at which it stays a liquid, unlike water can stay a liquid for in a broader temperature range. And it would have to be extraordinarily cold. It'd have to be like negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit, between negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 70 degrees Celsius or negative 70 degrees Celsius, and negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and that, I don't know, like 30 degrees Celsius, negative 30 degrees Celsius. Anyways, very cold, right? It has to be very cold. And chemical reactions at such cold temperatures can be pretty difficult, not impossible, but pretty difficult. And then there's one other thing. And then I think Deanna has an interesting avenue for us to explore. And that is that ammonia doesn't have surface tension, or it doesn't have as much surface tension as something like water. And so when you look at, beautiful, majestic forms of life, like redwood trees, for example, these things can get up to like 250, 350 feet tall. I think that's like 100 or so meters tall. And so that's super cool all by itself. But the only way that they can get that tall is that they can transport water all the way up, right? Hundreds of feet. And that part of the reason that works is because of something called capillary action. So if you ever dip like a paper towel in some water, the water starts to climb up the towel. That's capillary action. It just happens. It's a byproduct automatically. You don't need to actively do it. Don't need to pump it. And so without that capillary action, ammonia won't have that kind of capillary action. So as a result, a life form that could have evolved in an environment that's mostly ammonia, that in a planet that has as much ammonia liquid as we have liquid water, I would have to imagine it would have to be very, very, either very small, or maybe it might begin to look like animals that have open circulatory systems, like, for example, arthropods, like crabs. And so there's this meme, I know Deanna is familiar with this meme, that everything ultimately turns into a crab. So this is actually like a theory. It's called carcinization. It's been sort of exaggerated to meme status, but it is true that we've seen multiple instances throughout evolution of animals evolving that did not look like crabs initially, evolving to look like crabs, at least 5 times independently. And so it could very well be the case that in an environment where you can't rely on that capillary action to move water throughout bodies or throughout like plant-like structures, that maybe you have an open circulatory system and maybe it looks like a crab. Anyways, I know that we had another interesting topic. The Fermi Paradox, right? So do any of you are any of you familiar with the Fermi Paradox, and could you explain it to us if you are?
I guess, David, you're the most qualified for this one.
Oh boy, yeah, I've run across it a little bit. Again, I'm not the astrobiologist here, but I guess the idea is that if life develops in the universe here and it gets advanced enough to start traveling amongst the stars, why don't we see that advanced life? Why hasn't it gotten here? Why is it so quiet out there? I mean, you can imagine you get a species that can actually build these probes. I think they're called von Neumann probes, that can go on a planet, self-replicate, and then launch them more off to the next system, and just keep doing this over and over and over and over. And given a few million years, you probably could have investigated the entire the entire galaxy. And so why don't we see that? And so forth. So that's at least one aspect of it. That's not the only one, but I think it's one aspect of it. Why is it so quiet? Why don't we hear anything? Type of thing. So, and does that mean that we're the ones out here? Are we the only ones doing anything, or whatever? And then you start getting speculation. Is there like like in Star Trek, no interference clauses and so forth? You can't interfere with the society, and they've agreed on that. So that's why we don't hear anything, because they're not trying to get to us close up. I don't know, but that's basically it. So
I like the other side of that. Of course, it's the idea, as you said, we look and we can't find anything. Of course, we are only looking literally on our own doorstep. We can't really look further out. But there is the nice thing that maybe other intelligent life forms have seen what we're doing to this planet and are purposefully avoiding us and avoiding contact, because they just want to look at us and saw these slightly evolved apes throwing nuclear bombs around on their own planet, and we're like, you know what, let's just leave them alone for a while.
So there are two theories that I really like when it comes to the Fermi paradox. The first one is that there might have been like some kind of great epoch that actually dictated the life of this civilization. So a great epoch will be like something akin to like you know coming in unison and trying to advance technology so that they can become like a next tier civilization. Then if they did not achieve that, if they were kind of mired into like sort of like a local politics, if you will, and if they would that causes some kind of self annihilation, that will be a great epoch that they cannot overcome. The other one is the dark forest theory, which is to say that there are even more advanced civilizations that can actually harness, the 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 galaxies that they inhabit. So the reason why everything is quiet is because if you give out a signal, basically like you're just uh, like flashing light in a dark forest, you're giving away your position. So in a way that if there is like the civilizations that surround you are energy hungry, like they just want to go out there and spread, right? So you're giving away your location. So basically, you're endangering yourself, anybody around you, and that's even like a more scarier thought. But yeah, these are the things that I heard about the regarding the Fermi paradox, which I found to be very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and then of course, and I feel like this might actually physically nauseate Deanna if I say this phrase, but I can't help it. What if it's a simulation, right?
Computer and simulation.
I'm
Right.
just not commenting.
You're right.
Well, I mean, if you're willing, and well, no, okay. So Deanna, you wanted to discuss something very interesting that I've always found kind of fascinating, which are rogue planets. And so, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I love the idea of rogue planets. So rogue planets are planets that are not tied to a star. They're basically traveling freely throughout the galaxy. It's estimated that just within the Milky Way, there's probably at least 10,000 of these, probably many more. This can happen when a solar system is forming. There's a lot of forces at play. Some planets can just knock other planets out of orbit. But you can also have things like a flyby of a close star. So if a star were to pass close enough to the solar system, it could actually turn us into a rogue planet and basically kick us out of the orbit. Of course, then you're traveling throughout the universe without a star, which makes it very, very difficult to actually sustain life. But the cool thing is that rogue planets could actually potentially harbor life despite moving away from the star and eventually not having a star. The way they would do this is using geothermal energy, so the energy of the planet itself. So we know that our planet is extremely active. At the center, it has this really hot core. So it is constantly giving off energy. A very small amount, like 99.7% of our energy comes from the sun. But there's this other 0.3% that is actually geothermal energy. So if you have a rogue planet, it will generate heat from its geothermal energy. Now, the perfect scenario here for life is if you have a frozen ocean, like a couple kilometers deep, and underneath the ice, you actually have a liquid ocean. So then this ocean would stay warm from the geothermal energy. And the layer of ice would protect the ocean from radiation, from asteroids. So it's actually a completely isolated and potentially perfect habitat. We've actually seen some things like this on Earth. If you go underneath the ice in the Arctic or Antarctica, you can actually find these geothermal vents that are thriving with really crazy life forms. So there's the idea that rogue planets could actually have something similar. And it's fun. I think it's very curious to think what these life forms would look like. Obviously, they wouldn't have any sunlight, so they'd probably be completely blind. They would probably be small because they can only rely on geothermal energy, so they couldn't grow so big. In the event that intelligent life could develop on one of these rogue planets, they would be limited by the fact that they are entirely in the ocean. So obviously they're not going to develop fire, which is going to greatly limit the advance of a civilization. And there's a cool thing that would such a civilization, hypothetically speaking, an intelligent civilization, actually know that there's any other planet out there. If all they can see around them is just this frozen ice, would they even know that they're part of a bigger universe? To me, this is really, really cool. And there's actually models that tie rogue planets as like the ones that bring life to other planets. So hypothetically, a comet could break off of a rogue planet and bring life to Earth or to other places. Just the whole concept of rogue planets is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by.
There's a lot there. So
There's so much there.
And so, but an interesting feature of human evolution, but really just like the evolution of life on Earth, is that some of the earliest forms of metabolism actually evolved using sulfur rather than relying on oxygen. And they're still around. But there have been fossils discovered that are like 2.5 billion years old, right? Think about how long ago that was. Not million, billion. And that predates when oxygen became so common on Earth, right? And so today we have these little types of the kind that Deanna was sort of describing, things like cyanobacteria, right? That exist in super extreme environments, environments that are typically oxygen free. And they need to be oxygen free. They're obligatory, they cannot be exposed to oxygen. It's toxic to them. And they're called extremophiles, a sort of category of organisms. And so places like hot springs, and then sort of like these muddy areas at the bottom of bodies of water that are protected from light, protected from oxygen, they're completely hypoxic. That's where these little types of organisms live. But once again, just because like Earth isn't particularly hospitable to these iterations of life in most places, right, because of how much oxygen there is, doesn't mean that a planet that has little or no oxygen couldn't exist and be hospitable to them, living in, more ecological niches that are just more common on like a rogue planet, for example. They wouldn't be restricted to only, certain very specific parts of the planet if there's just a bunch of things like hot springs and, things like that around on the planet. I don't know. It's fascinating. And then, of course, Deanna also brought up the notion of panspermia, which I don't know if anybody would like to explore that concept. Professor Dunn, do you have?
Yeah. Sorry. You basically start life on one world. A collision of some sort knocks off a chunk of that world, and it flies and then lands someplace else, and then seeds life on another world. I know some people suggested that maybe Mars had life first, and something broke off of Mars and landed on the Earth. But that's the idea, is panspermia. And of course, you could get artificial panspermia, I suppose, if we start exploring and bring our bacteria with us. We could seed other plants. Even if we tried not to, we still could. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was like, when I was thinking about, the whole argument of, maybe, whether or not we consider viruses to be life, putting that discussion aside, if you could imagine a planet that, once hosted complex life like humans and stuff, but then some kind of, cataclysm occurred and it wiped out most forms of life. Well, viruses probably would have emerged, something like viruses would have probably emerged on a planet like that. The origins of viruses are very interesting. I know somebody brought up the role that viruses might have played in abiogenesis, and we can talk about that if anybody's interested. But you could imagine, viruses in the right conditions can be basically frozen in place, but viable if released. And so one could imagine, we send a probe to some planet, some frozen, icy planet that has no signs of life, right? We land our probe, and it has physical feet that like touch into whatever, some kind of methane snow or something, and then it comes back to Earth, and then all of a sudden, this virus has a whole new planet full of, critters that it can infect and potentially cause another cataclysm. I don't know. That was just sort of like this. Not super believable, but just sort of fun little avenue that my mind went down. And so Abyss, I know, has a point about carbon-based life forms that could be formed in different ways. Did you want to get into that, Abyss?
Yeah. So far, I think that the life that we have here on Earth is basically predefined by its predecessor, like the first life forms that we have, right? And the way things are organized is very unique. So by that I mean like our DNA is actually spiraling in a very unique way. The molecules that we take in, like for example, like the sugar molecule that we constantly metabolize. It's oriented in a very specific way. It's all left-handed, so this is what we call as the allosteric configuration. So even if there's like a carbon-based life form elsewhere, that there's this possibility that the configuration might be different, that we may not be able to literally interact with it. Like for example, for a given like a right-handed sugar, for example, we can't metabolize that. Technically, that's useless for us. And there are some cases where you know um, the complex or organic molecules that we can find in other planets can be detrimental to us as well. Of course, like that remains to be seen. But what I'm curious about, like what I really want to bring about as a key example as to how these molecular variation can cause is that this is uh, a typical horseshoe crab. It has a unique type of blood among all animals, which is like a blue blood. And the reason why is that it's technically a heme structure, or what we call as heme, which our hemoglobin is actually derived from. But it's actually sent in its center, instead of iron, like us, it has copper. So that by itself would change the the whole function, the coloration, and then also the whole function as well. Same thing with chlorophyll. Instead of like, I mean, the structure is pretty much the same with hemoglobin, except that they have magnesium as opposed to like iron in there. So so these different configuration changes can actually vary the functionality of those molecules, which are biological in nature. So we have to take into account that there are these infinite, combinatorial explosions of molecules or diversities that we can get in life on different planets, even in our own planet, that remains to be investigated. So even if like the whole idea about silicon-based life form is really compelling and other building blocks for life, of course, like assuming that we have a universal definition of life, um, that these might seem very compelling. There are these nuances, much more, um, which present like more complexity as to what life can literally be and how it functions. So that's what I want to bring up.
So the picture that you brought up of horseshoe crabs basically being milked is a nice kind of way to say it, but really what they're being is bled out. What's really cool about horseshoe crabs, so first of all, that is an ancient animal. Like it's like one of the handful of living fossils. But what's cool, it's been around for so long, right? So it's seen a lot of things, seen a lot of pathogens, and it turns out that its blood is actually medically very useful. Like today, right now, it's being used to basically detect, because it has this very characterized reaction to the presence of any kind of, really broadly speaking, pathogens. And so it can be used to determine whether or not something is potentially pathogenic, potentially impure, or could potentially cause an infection. So it has this and it's very it's difficult to replicate the way that this blood, which is pretty readily available, the way that it can be applied synthetically, right, artificially. Obviously, there are other ways to do what it's used for, but it's just so effective and simple. So horseshoe crabs they don't get enough appreciation. I'm a big fan of horseshoe crabs. Okay, so we have a couple more sort of general sciencey questions. So Andy says, would another planet that had liquid water with a similar gravitational pull but 8 times the size of Earth be habitable? What are your reactions, our physicist panelists?
So I'm busy trying to calculate the density of such a planet.
Yes,
in
exactly.
My mind, because if we're maintaining the same gravitational pull, so the gravitational pull on a planet depends on its mass and its radius. So if we're maintaining the same gravitational pull, but we're making the planet bigger, then that means the mass also has to be different to what it is on Earth. That would affect the density of the planet. And I was just trying to figure out in which direction it goes and got distracted. But I see David is doing the back of the envelope calculation for us. Perfect. So if the density is different, then it might no longer be a rocky planet. Like you might be treading into the gassy planet, in which case it's not habitable. If it is still a rocky planet and it has the same gravitational pull as on Earth, then you have other conditions as well. You need water, you need not too many nighttime, daytime variations. But I think this does allow us to make a fun point that the gravitational force actually does play a role in how big animals can grow. Like if you are on a planet with a much stronger gravitational force, then you're more likely to be a smaller species because it's just easier to build something smaller. If life developed on the moon, for an example, where the gravitational force is much less, you'd probably have bigger species. So I think this is really cool. It's often not considered in sci-fi, and I think it's an avenue that could be explored a lot more. That you would actually have a very big size difference based on the gravitational force. And that actually allows me to make another completely tangential comment that during my undergrad, I took a course on biophysics and was almost ended up in biophysics. And one of the fun things we had to calculate is how big can insects actually grow due to the gravitational force. And basically seeing if these like massive critters you see in some horror films are actually possible. And the answer is basically no. There is a upper limit on how big insects and some species can be, just based on the gravitational force. And I think that's really cool. David, do you have a calculation for us?
No, you've got the the infamous this, right? B equals gm over r squared, right? That's how you calculate the acceleration due to gravity.
Sure.
So if r is bigger by a factor of 8, right? That means that bottom part's 64 times bigger, which means m has to be 64 times bigger, if I'm not mistaken, to make g the same.
Yeah, I agree.
That's right. Yeah. So that's a big mass. That's a huge.
That's a big mass.
Big
I
mass.
think that would make the density less than on Earth.
Yeah.
Right. So Deanna, as you were describing what such a planet might look like, I was reminded of a concept from Carl Sagan. I think he came up with the concept of floaters, just kind of a funny name for an animal. But the concept is that there are these very, very large balloon-like creatures that sort of float through the clouds on a planet like Venus or Jupiter and can harvest somehow some kind of chemical energy by doing so. Probably one of the less likely organisms in my mind. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, another thing, Deanna, that you brought up is that, like, I had to do the same kind of exercise with, like, what is the maximum size of a given organism, like an ant? How big could an ant get, or how big could an insect get, right? Other types of insects. Something else that came to mind. Something that came to mind when we were talking about the ammonia planet, right? Is because of the lack of capillary action, because ammonia isn't just going to flow up through bodies like water does. Is that one of the reasons that I was like, well, it's probably going to have to be crabs that live on that kind of a planet, is that insects have open circulatory systems, right? So we have a closed circulatory system. We do have a heart that pumps our blood, right? And insects are small enough where they don't really have to do that. They just have oxygen kind of just diffuse into their bodies. And so one could imagine that you could have either an organism. This is in the ammonia world, right? You could have an organism that either all of its vasculature, it has a closed circulatory system, but all of its vasculature is wrapped in muscle. Our vasculature is wrapped in muscle, but not really strong muscle that can do stuff. And then that muscle along their vasculature squeezes the liquid through their vessels, or they have an open circulatory system. And so once again, they'd probably look kind of like crabs, if that big, if even remotely that big. Okay, so now Andy brings up another interesting prompt. So if every star in the galaxy is supposed to have at least one or more planets orbiting it, there just has to be other life in our Milky Way, right? Any thoughts? Abyss, do you have any thoughts?
Speaking purely from probabilistic point of view, it does make sense that if you have like 100,000 stars in I think that's the rough estimate, like 100,000 stars in the Milky Way, then one of them is bound to have life. But how would we be able to detect that? That's also another issue, because right at this point, the only marker that we have is looking at the atmospheric content of like these transient objects, or they can be planets for that matter. and we have to be extremely lucky to kind of position ourselves to look at what the atmospheric composition is. So that by itself would have an additional barrier to discovering life on different planets. Another theory which I heard, which is far more interesting in regards to what you were talking about earlier, is that the gravitation on some planets might be really strong enough that the civilization, even though they are they are civilization by our definition, that they have technological prowess, that they may not be able to leave the planet. No amount of chemical combustion can actually make them leave the planet. So they're earthbound, or at least like planet bound for the rest of their time. So that's also another interesting to consider. But yeah, I mean, given the probability, even though like we don't have to go as far as considering the Drake equation, which calculates the probability of life on different planets, but probabilistically, I would like to say yes. But yeah, it's I don't know, but the probability says that there is a life. I
Okay,
would
so
like
we
to
have a
hear what
yes from
others think.
Abyss.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we have a yes from Abyss. So Professor Dunn, what is your
Again, the
yay or nay?
yeah, the probability thing is kind of like, okay, we can't be the only life out here now, unless of course life just has something that needs some incredible thing that just happened to happen on the Earth and no place else, because just the path had to be perfect. You would think that life would have to develop elsewhere. Now, you're talking about life, bacteria. That's one thing. Of course, you want to talk about animal life or whatever. That might be something completely different. Maybe it's much more unlikely that everything even more has to be correct for that to exist. So, I think life is out there. Advanced life, or you might say animal life. I'm not as maybe clear on that. There just might be too many things that have to go right for it to exist, at least for a long
Okay,
period.
I'm marking you down as a tentative yes.
Yeah,
reticent,
yes, just to life,
yes.
just to life, just not advanced.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Deanna, do you want to bring us home? What do you think?
Yeah, so I obviously the probabilistic argument is very compelling. There's just so many planets out there. We also have moons. We also have rogue planets. There's just so many places where life could be hiding. But then there's the other thing. There are so many ways the universe can randomly kill us. There are so many dangers out there, so many extinction events that just within our solar system, probably over half of these planets would be in range of a supernova or a gamma ray burst, and therefore would have mass extinction events. If life even existed, it might already no longer be there. Other ones just have a completely inhospitable environment due to asteroids, radiation, so many things. Like there are thousands of ways the universe could kill us. So I think that makes it slightly less likely. And then there's the other thing that in order for us to actually find, so I'm sure that at some point we will find microscopic life forms. I'm very sure of that. I'm hopeful that we will at some point. But to actually find an advanced life form requires not only the perfect conditions for life, as David was saying, and the universe not destroying it, but also for us to be on similar timelines. Because it wouldn't really help us if someone's looking at Earth how it looked billions of years ago, they're not going to see any life. So we also need to be on similar timelines. So I think it's very likely that there is life out there. I think it's likely that we'll find microscopic life, but I don't think we'll find complex life in my lifetime.
Yeah, that sounds completely rational to me. I mean, that's 100% where I'm at. And I am very confident that there's other forms of what we would recognize as life, replicating, self-replicating, consumes energy, produces waste, that type of model. It would be very shocking. Well, what is the quote? It would be an awful waste of space if there weren't. But yeah, I'm optimistic. I also don't think that we'll find it in my lifetime, but maybe my daughter's lifetime. Who knows? Maybe she'll be the one to discover it. All right, everybody. So thank you all so much for joining. Thanks to you all for joining me. Deanna Hooper, you can check her out. She's, again, a theoretical physicist. You can check her out. She's active on HAPS. Professor David Dunn, also active on HAPS. And then Abyss, not as active as we would like to see him be, but he is around on HAPS as well. So thank you all three for joining me. My name is Ian McLaughlin. I am fairly active on HAPS as well. And you can check all of our stuff out. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime.